How did Europe respond to the end of World War I? Although we tend to focus on the physical impact of World War I, considering there were estimated 40 million people killed, World War I had a much broader impact on society because World War I broke down the traditional structures in Europe of European society, leading to an increased sense of nihilism, which paved the way to radical social and political factions emerging. Well, how did it do this, you might be wondering? Well, firstly, it embraced the absurd. Secondly, it led to a return of a decadent culture. And lastly, it drove many to search for communities, be they good or bad. Let's start by looking at how they all embraced the absurd. Now, to understand this, we have to look at what caused World War I. And this would be the issue of affluence. The affluent society meant there was led to a loss of meaning in European societies. There was no purpose to life for them because they had everything already, not completely, of course, but they had everything laid out for them. And this led to the senseless violence of World War I. There was no real reason for World War I to be fought. It was just a self-destructing society after years of prosperity. This senseless violence caused an increased this violence increased cyclically, that each act of violence was reciprocated and enlarged. It left the participants demoralized and filled with regret. Without meaning from European culture, the cultural superiority that had once dominated through Europe, many felt lost. And one of the biggest groups to capitalize on this was the market. They discovered that this sense of alienation and absurdity could be marketed as an indication of class status. And this fully emerged with the Dadaist movement. As Dr. Joseph LaRoche says, Dada intended to make war against war. As such, it was based in the very idea of destruction and the implementation of a sublimation of violence. So what exactly was this Dada movement that it's trying to fight war with war and embracing destruction? Well, it perfectly captured the absurd in such a way as to protest senseless killing. Confronted by the absurdity of modern warfare, they left traditional morality, nationalism, and religious for the absurd. So, for example, a person named Man Ray wrote a Dadaist cookbook. Except for the fact that it would be rather hard to cook almost everything on it, as he included ingredients such as wood blocks, olive jars, after dumping the olives, of course, machine oil, and French bread, painted blue. This is an example of the Dadaist movement, how they're embracing the absurd. They don't have any real meaning or purpose to it. It's frankly absurd and nothing else. And one of the other major facets to the Dadaist movement is how they used mass-produced items to confront the dullness of modern life. The society that had led them into the senseless violence with their mass-produced weapons of machines for war was now being ridiculed with pieces of art such as a urinal just simply turned on its side. This embracement of the absurd is a direct result of World War I and all of its violence. Secondly, we can look at a return of a decadent culture throughout all of Europe. Now, the decadent culture had many rises and falls throughout the past, but with the end of World War I, it returned to the forefront in Europe once more. They tried to dull their senses with drugs and alcohol, and it caused cultural expressions like jazz emerged, untainted by the horrors of World War I. Gangsters were anti-heroes, and especially in Europe, governments weakened by war allowed the rise of organized crime. So, what exactly does this all mean, and how did it play out? Well, with the end of World War I, many had lost. Many were now feeling lost and destroyed, as I talked about earlier. And one of the best ways to dull the senses is with drugs. Not that it's a good thing, I don't embrace drug use, but it is effective at numbing emotions. And as William McAdoo put in 1923, there's an almost unbroken line of the statements from drug addicts among men that they began taking drugs at public dance halls. End quote. Now, why would they begin here? Well, let's take a young man at a club after a long day at work. He's really tired, he's been up all day working, barely had any time to eat or relax, and going out to a club is a long all-night event, and before long, he reasonably begins to feel quite tired. However, all the other men are wide awake, dancing, drinking, and spending time with the ladies. The solution? Drugs. A friend of his will hand him some cocaine, heroin, or some other stimulant, and he'll be fully energized and dancing again in no time. Now, we might not see this as a good thing, of course, but it was clearly an effective way for the people of Europe to suppress their emotions after the end of World War I and all of its violence. And lastly, we can see the impact of the end of World War I on European society through the search for their community and the rise of political factions it led to. And of course, the biggest example of this would be Hitler. Hitler, not very long, felt lost after the end of World War I, like many other people at his time. And he wanted to join a new quasi-family, rather the one that he had left after the war from his fellow soldiers. He became an intelligence officer, investigating right-wing factions that had risen up. But during these investigations, rather than trying to stop them, he joined them. And more specifically, he joined the National Socialist Party. And he quickly rose through the ranks to become the party's chief. And it was through this search for community that the rise of Nazis was able to take place. As men wanted to feel the belonging they had felt in the trenches once more. Because one thing we very rarely think about with war is that during the actual fighting, men generally have very few problems. It is only once very few mental problems. It is only once they return home and try to reintegrate with society that issues such as PTSD and trauma are brought forward. And because men wanted to feel the belonging they felt in the trenches again and didn't fit in with society, many turned to radical political groups as a result. And with Western values and Christian morality now fully discredited to them, they had nowhere to turn but to these groups like communism, fascism, socialism, and other quasi-religious, materialistic cults. If it were not for the end of World War I, then if it weren't for World War I in general, that is, they still would have had their community and likely would not have felt the desperate need or longing to join these cults. Overall, Edmund Taylor puts it best. The First World War killed fewer victims than the Second World War, but in many ways it left even deeper scars both on the mind and on the map of Europe. End quote. From the destruction of traditional society, leading to an embracement of the absurd, a return of decadent culture, and a search for community, both good and bad, the end of World War I was truly paved the way for radical political factions and led to an increased sense of nihilism.